Fred Hampton emerged as a powerful young leader of the Black Panther Party, advocating revolutionary change, racial solidarity, and resistance to systemic oppression. But to understand why his name still echoes through history, we must first understand the world he stepped into and why his voice mattered so much. In the late 1960s, America stood at a crossroads. Legal segregation was crumbling, yet inequality remained deeply rooted. Police violence, civic poverty, and political exclusion shaped daily life for millions of Black Americans. Into this moment stepped Fred Hampton, not as a politician, not as a celebrity, but as a gifted organizer with an extraordinary ability to unite people. At just 21 years old, he spoke with clarity, urgency, and purpose. He did not just criticize injustice. He built alternatives. Hampton believed real power began at the community level. He helped organize free breakfast programs for children, health clinics for the poor, and political education for those long denied a voice. More importantly, he rejected division. While others focused on race alone, Hampton called for solidarity across class and color, insisting that ordinary people, black, white, and brown, shared common struggles and common interests. That message carried weight. It inspired hope, organization, and confidence among the marginalized, and it made powerful institutions deeply uncomfortable. To the authorities watching closely, Hampton was not just an activist, he was a unifier, a communicator, and a rising force who could shift the direction of the country. This is not just a story about the past. It is a story about how ideas spread, how power responds when challenged, and how young voices can shape history in ways far beyond their years. If you are ready to explore the life, impact, and legacy of a man whose influence reached far beyond his short lifetime, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the story of Fred Hampton is one you need to hear, and one we must continue to remember. Despite civil rights gains, ongoing poverty, police brutality, and social exclusion shaped the daily reality of the communities Fred Hampton served, and it was within this contradiction that his political consciousness deepened. Laws had changed on paper, but life on the streets told a different story. Jobs were scarce, housing was overcrowded, schools were underfunded, and encounters with law enforcement often carried fear rather than protection. For many young people, hope promised by reform seemed distant, abstract, and slow, while suffering remained immediate and visible. Hampton understood that frustration not as chaos, but as a warning sign that deeper change was required. What set him apart was his ability to translate that frustration into organized purpose. He saw that anger alone could burn out quickly, but structure, education, and service could sustain a movement. Rather than waiting for institutions to respond, Hampton and those around him began building what they believed had been denied to them: dignity, care, and political voice. Community-based programs became both a response to material hardship and a statement of self-determination. Feeding children before school was not charity in his eyes. It was a declaration that no system had the right to neglect its youngest members. Offering medical care where none existed was not symbolic protest, but a direct answer to lived neglect. These initiatives were rooted in the belief that people who struggled to survive each day could not fully engage in political life without first addressing basic needs. Hampton often spoke of education not only as classroom learning, but as awareness, helping people recognize why their conditions existed and who benefited from their continuation. Political education classes, community meetings, and everyday conversations became tools for empowerment, transforming despair into clarity and isolation into collective strength. Through this process, organizing was no longer an abstract ideology. It became a practical response to real conditions. At the same time, Hampton rejected the idea that oppression operated along a single line. He observed that poverty and exclusion cut across neighborhoods and skin tones, binding people together through shared experience rather than inherited identity. This insight pushed his organizing beyond traditional boundaries and challenged narratives that kept communities divided. By emphasizing common struggles, he reshaped activism into something broader and more inclusive, where unity was not based on sameness but on mutual interest and shared dignity. As these efforts grew, so did their impact. People who had long felt invisible began to see themselves as part of something larger, something capable of change. Parents trusted their children would be cared for, neighbors found purpose in participation, and young people discovered leadership within themselves. This quiet transformation, built through consistency rather than spectacle, gave Hampton's work its real power. It was not loud declarations that sustained the movement, but the steady presence of organization embedded in everyday life. Yet this very effectiveness drew intense attention. Systems accustomed to managing discontent through neglect or force now faced an approach that combined compassion with political clarity. Hampton's work exposed a simple truth. When people are organized, informed, and supported, they become harder to control. His response to injustice did not rely on chaos or fear, but on discipline, vision, and belief in collective action. In this space between unmet promises and emerging possibilities, Fred Hampton's leadership took shape, grounded not in theory alone, but in the lived experiences of those who walked beside him. As Fred Hampton's organizing matured, his vision moved beyond protest and into construction. Shaped by the belief that lasting change required more than opposition, it required care, coordination, and trust. The social initiatives he helped lead were not separate from his political ideas. They were their living expression. In neighborhoods where hunger was routine and medical attention a luxury, these programs addressed immediate needs while quietly reshaping how people understood power. The free breakfast programs, for example, transformed early mornings into spaces of stability and dignity. Children arrived not only to eat, but to feel seen, to start their day with the reassurance that someone had planned for their well-being. Parents, many working long hours or navigating unstable conditions, found relief in knowing their children were nourished and safe. What appeared simple on the surface carried deeper meaning. It demonstrated that organized communities could meet needs that institutions had long ignored. Health clinics followed the same principle. In areas where hospitals felt distant or unwelcoming, these clinics became points of access and trust. They provided basic care, education, and prevention, often staffed by volunteers who understood the realities of the people they served. The clinics did more than treat illness. They challenged the idea that quality care was a privilege rather than a right. By placing these services within the community itself, Hampton and his colleagues reinforced a sense of ownership and collective responsibility. People were no longer passive recipients of neglect, but active participants in their own survival and progress. Yet perhaps the most far-reaching aspect of Hampton's leadership was his ability to connect these practical efforts to a broader vision of unity. He recognized that hunger, poor health, and political exclusion were not confined to a single group, and that division only strengthened the systems that produced them. This understanding gave rise to what became known as the Rainbow Coalition, an alliance that brought together groups who had rarely stood on the same side of history: poor black communities, working-class white groups, and marginalized Latino organizations found common ground not through ideology alone, but through shared conditions and shared goals. Hampton's role within this coalition was not to erase differences, but to reframe them. He encouraged each group to retain its identity while recognizing its connection to the others. Meetings became spaces where grievances were voiced openly, but also where solutions were imagined collectively. This approach challenged long-standing assumptions that unity across race and culture was unrealistic or fragile. Under Hampton's guidance, cooperation became practical rather than symbolic, rooted in mutual aid, shared planning, and respect. The strength of these alliances lay in their everyday impact. When communities collaborated, resources stretched further, knowledge spread faster, and isolation gave way to solidarity. Small victories accumulated. A clinic opened, a food program expanded, a neighborhood organized. These moments built confidence and demonstrated that collaboration was not only possible, but effective. People began to see themselves as part of a wider movement, connected by purpose rather than divided by circumstance. Through these initiatives, Hampton redefined leadership. He did not position himself above the people he served, but among them, listening as much as he spoke. His presence energized others to step forward, to take responsibility, and to believe that collective action could reshape their future. In building programs that fed, healed, and united, Fred Hampton showed that social change was not an abstract dream, but a process grounded in care, discipline, and shared humanity. As Fred Hampton's influence expanded through community programs and cross-racial cooperation, it began to draw the focused attention of powerful institutions that interpreted unity itself as a challenge. To the FBI and the Chicago police, Hampton was not simply a local organizer responding to neighborhood needs. He represented something far more unsettling. He was young, disciplined, and persuasive, with the rare ability to connect political ideas to everyday life. His message did not rely on fear or spectacle, but on clarity and organization, and that made it harder to dismiss. What concerned authorities most was not any single program or speech, but the possibility that his approach could spread, inspire replication, and reshape how people understood their own power. Surveillance became constant and deliberate. Meetings were monitored, phone calls tracked, and personal movements documented with quiet persistence. Reports were written not only about what Hampton did, but about what he might do, what he could become, and who he might influence. In this atmosphere, suspicion replaced dialogue. Rather than engaging with the substance of his work, agencies chose to frame it as dangerous, exaggerating intent and isolating context. Disinformation played a key role in this process. Rumors were circulated, tensions were encouraged, and false narratives were introduced to create distrust both within organizations and between allied groups. The goal was not immediate confrontation, but gradual erosion from within. This strategy operated through a broader federal initiative known as COINTELPRO, a program designed to disrupt political movements deemed threatening to the existing order. Under this framework, Hampton and others like him were treated less as citizens and more as problems to be managed. Letters were sent, alliances questioned, and internal divisions quietly amplified. The work was subtle, often invisible to those experiencing its effects, but deeply impactful. Relationships that had taken months to build could be strained in weeks, and progress achieved through cooperation could be slowed by suspicion. What made Hampton particularly vulnerable was not recklessness, but effectiveness. His ability to connect diverse communities challenged long-standing assumptions that people could be kept divided indefinitely. He spoke openly about solidarity, not as an abstract moral idea, but as a practical necessity. This perspective threatened narratives that relied on separation to maintain control. As a result, attention intensified. Local law enforcement aligned with federal efforts, sharing information and reinforcing a shared sense of urgency. Hampton's name began to circulate in official spaces far removed from the neighborhoods he served, discussed not in terms of service, but in terms of containment. Despite this pressure, Hampton remained focused on his work. He continued to organize, to speak, and to build structures that outlasted individual moments. Yet the weight of constant monitoring had consequences. Time and energy that could have been devoted to expansion were increasingly spent responding to accusations, legal challenges, and public misrepresentation. Even so, his commitment did not waver. He understood that scrutiny was often the price of effectiveness, and that progress rarely comes without resistance. The campaign against Hampton revealed a deeper truth about power, that systems often react most strongly not to chaos, but to organization rooted in trust. His leadership exposed vulnerabilities in narratives that claimed equality while tolerating exclusion. By choosing to feed children, heal the sick, and unite the marginalized, Hampton demonstrated an alternative vision of authority, one grounded in service rather than control. It was this vision, more than any single action, that drew the full weight of institutional response, setting the stage for what would follow and underscoring the lasting impact of his short but profound life. By the end of 1969, the pressure surrounding Fred Hampton had reached a breaking point, shaped by months of surveillance, distortion, and escalating tension between his movement and the authorities watching it closely. In the early hours of December 4th, while the city of Chicago was still quiet and dark, that pressure crystallized into a single, irreversible moment. Before dawn, police officers arrived at an apartment on the West Side where members of the Black Panther Party were sleeping. Inside, Hampton lay in bed beside his young partner, unaware that the night would mark the end of his life. What followed was immediately presented to the public as a sudden confrontation, a necessary response to alleged danger. Officials claimed they had encountered armed resistance while carrying out their duties, yet almost from the beginning, the physical evidence told a different story. The pattern of damage inside the apartment, the direction of bullets, and the testimony of those who survived raised serious questions about how events actually unfolded. Walls, doors, and furniture bore signs not of a balanced exchange, but of overwhelming force directed inward. The contrast between official statements and observable facts created a growing sense that the truth was being obscured rather than clarified. As investigators and independent observers examined the scene more closely, inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Forensic analysis indicated that the vast majority of gunfire came from outside the apartment, contradicting early claims of a sustained exchange. Witnesses described confusion, fear, and the sound of gunfire cutting through the stillness of the morning with little warning. Hampton himself never left his bed. Those closest to him recalled that he did not have the opportunity to respond, speak, or protect himself. The image that emerged was not one of chaos initiated from within, but of a sudden, decisive act carried out against people who were largely defenseless at that moment. The aftermath was marked by shock and grief, but also by determination. Community members, activists, and legal advocates refused to accept the initial narrative without scrutiny. The apartment was opened to the public, allowing observers to see the damage firsthand. What they saw further undermined claims of a fair or necessary operation. The imbalance in force was evident, and the explanation offered by authorities seemed increasingly detached from the reality preserved in the physical space itself. Over time, the gap between statement and evidence became a focal point for wider questions about accountability and power. Legal proceedings would stretch on for years, revealing documents and testimonies that deepened public understanding of the events surrounding Hampton's death. Although criminal convictions never materialized, civil cases acknowledged serious violations of rights and led to financial settlements. These outcomes, while significant, did little to resolve the deeper moral questions raised by that morning. For many, the issue was never solely about legal definitions, but about the use of authority and the consequences faced by those who challenge entrenched systems through organization and unity. Hampton's death marked a turning point, not only for those who knew him personally, but for a generation grappling with the limits of reform and the risks of dissent. His life had been defined by building, educating, and uniting, yet his final moments were shaped by fear and mistrust at the highest levels of power. The contrast between the world he worked to create and the way his life ended left a lasting imprint on American history. In the years since, December 4th, 1969 has come to symbolize more than the loss of a single individual. It stands as a reminder of how quickly hope can collide with authority, and how narratives are constructed in the moments that follow. Fred Hampton's voice was silenced that morning, but the questions raised by his death continue to echo, challenging each generation to reflect on justice, truth, and the cost of meaningful change. In the years that followed the events of December 4th, 1969, the story of Fred Hampton did not fade into silence. Instead, it continued to unfold through investigations, court proceedings, and the persistence of those who refused to let the truth be buried. As new evidence emerged and official narratives were re-examined, a clearer picture began to take shape, one that acknowledged serious violations of civil rights and the misuse of authority. Though no outcome could restore a life cut short, these findings carried deep significance. They affirmed that what happened was not simply a tragic accident of history, but part of a broader pattern of repression directed at movements seeking meaningful change. The legal settlements that followed represented more than financial compensation. They stood as formal recognition that constitutional rights had been violated and that government institutions had acted improperly. For many, this acknowledgement mattered as much as any ruling. It validated the voices of witnesses, survivors, and community members who had long insisted that the truth was being ignored. Yet even as these cases closed, the questions they raised remained open, echoing far beyond the courtroom and into the national conscience. Fred Hampton's legacy, however, cannot be measured solely through legal outcomes. His lasting impact lives in the ideas he championed and the example he set. He demonstrated that solidarity could be stronger than division, that communities could organize to meet their own needs, and that leadership rooted in service could inspire lasting change. His vision of unity across racial and economic lines challenged narratives designed to keep people separated, and it continues to resonate in movements that seek justice through cooperation rather than isolation. Today, Hampton is remembered not only as a victim of political repression, but as a symbol of possibility. His life reminds us that age does not limit influence, that clarity of purpose can move people to action, and that courage often comes at a cost. The programs he helped build, the alliances he encouraged, and the words he spoke all reflect a belief in shared humanity and collective responsibility. Even decades later, those principles remain relevant in a world still grappling with inequality and exclusion. As we reflect on his story, we are reminded that history is shaped not only by those who hold power, but by those who challenge it with ideas, organization, and compassion. Fred Hampton's life invites us to question, to learn, and to consider how solidarity can become a force for transformation rather than conflict. His legacy endures because it speaks to universal struggles and enduring hopes. Thank you for spending this time with us and for listening to this story. If you found value in exploring the life and legacy of Fred Hampton, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories that deserve to be remembered, examined, and passed on to future generations.